It is often thought that society and civilization advances, like science, along a relatively linear path of progress towards happiness, let's call it that. And yes, we have our different ideologies and religions and political and economic views, and they have their fundamental differences. But the prevailing definition of this progress or this destination has taken to be liberal, a meta-ideology where differences, however sharp, are put aside for the sake of general peace and harmony and goodwill, where individual rights and freedoms are upheld. However, like science, there is the uncomfortable argument, perhaps even superior, that there is no linear path of progress, that the very metrics of progress can never objectively be defined, and that what we call progress is in fact an arbitrary shifting between one paradigm and another. And in just a way that the history of science, with its revolutions, gives us the strongest arguments that our present theories are, or maybe false or not right, I use history as a skeptical argument about this linear progression of society. Now, what most people have been talking about recently is the storming of the Capitol building in Washington. And many of my friends and people, and sometimes even reflected in the media, what they usually say is, how could this happen? How could this happen to this nation? How could this happen in the 21st century? And sometimes this type of shock is reflected in more personal stories. A friend of mine recently told me how, as a woman, she's treated in a certain way in her bank by her male colleagues. And when we talk about this, she says, I can't believe we're still having to fight these battles in the 21st century. I myself, being a black man, has just started to realize what racism actually is. It's not necessarily an act of violence or malice, but sometimes just perception. People just don't expect things from you, and they don't expect you to go far. And we discuss these things, and we ask ourselves, well, how is it that these things, these practices, sometimes even these views prevail in the 21st century? My answer is, it is that liberal principles just don't go deep enough. They don't go deep enough into the human psyche, disposition, and that they're actually destined to collapse from time to time into vicious and illiberal societies, only for us to restart the liberal program again, usually falsely assuming that this time the illiberal evils will not occur again. How in the 21st century? Actually, I believe it is only a matter of time until we go backwards again, and here are my historical arguments, briefly outlined. Number 1, the First World War. In geopolitical terms, the modern world has not seen a prolonged period of global peace than between the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which I think was a world war of its own, and the First World War, the Great War. Stained, of course, by a few conflicts, Crimea, the Boer War in South Africa, and so on. However, the birth of the German state changed the balance of power considerably, and a deep desire in her to assert herself through martial means on Europe and her colonies around the world. It was feared, even as early as 1870, that a great European conflict was inevitable, and it, at the time, seemed imminent. Bismarck himself correctly prophesied that it would be sparked by a relatively small event in the Balkans, but would draw in the great titans of the world. However, on the eve of the Great War, liberal principles had advanced to an extent that a great war sometimes even still felt a bit too fantastical. Never before had civilization gone so far hitherto to universalize ethics from the strains of national interests, and to make everyone's good and well-being interdependent with everyone else's. I'm talking about nations here. There was the independence of the British dominions, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, a peaceful and benevolent relinquishing of power by an empire that the world just hadn't seen before. People don't just give up power for free. There was the gradual increasing of the political franchise and care for the poor by both Liberal and Conservative parties over a succession of decades, in Britain that is. There was the formation of the Labour Party itself, a party specifically set up to advance the cause of the relatively unrepresented working class. There was the Hague Convention, there was high finance, all the hallmarks of liberal progress, which at the time were extraordinary achievements. Where did it all go so wrong? How did basic, primitive aggression win over all that? Well, I say maybe all that was a bit too idealistic and just didn't go far enough. Argument number 2. The Second World War. Now, much has been said about the Treaty of Versailles and how it set the conditions for the Second World War, as Marshal Foch's remarkably accurate prediction of peace for 20 years was stated as soon as he read it. But what is not often given much attention is how in the 1930s, the former Allies did almost everything they could to prevent a Second World War. Concession after concession to Germany was made in the name of peace, epitomized obviously by the Munich Agreement, where the former Allies were more or less giving entire nations over to Germany in order to placate her aggression. Now, those who tried to speak common sense into power, like Churchill, were labelled warmongers and archaic until it was too late. So whereas the First World War was preceded by anyway, a building up of arms for deterrence, the Second World War was caused by the very opposite, the surrender of arms in the name of pacifism, a very liberal principle, in a way that I don't think has a parallel in history. Again, how did such belief in peace and fairness go so wrong? How did the advocates of pacifism get it so wrong? Again, maybe it didn't go far and deep enough. Argument number 3. Surely now, after the world had failed to make good on the 1920 slogan, the war to end all wars, and plunged us all into a Second World War, we would now, on the third attempt, try to make good on our intentions to make a peaceful world. Surely the fallen human race would at last turn its back on such apocalyptic catastrophes and see the sense in liberal principles. But no sooner had the Russians entered Berlin in 1945, had the tensions of the Cold War started to manifest. And these tensions would dominate the world for the next half a century. Again, it is not for the lack of liberal principles. America, who had so callously turned their backs on the League of Nations in the 1930s, a body, remember, conceived by their own President Wilson, spearheaded the formation of the United Nations as a global governing institution. Britain dissolved her empire, on the most part in the most pacific and benevolent of ways, certainly compared to other European empires. And she did her best to ensure that the new independent nations had the best chance of making it on their own. The Commonwealth was formed, not without bloodshed, and in doing this, I'm not just talking about crimes of humanity against native peoples by the European empires, but how these peoples themselves just flung themselves at each other after independence. Consider India. Even when all the leaders, Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, Mountbatten, did everything they could to prevent bloodshed, it still ruptured out of the bubbling hatred and antagonisms between the common Hindu and Muslim citizen. Decolonization was liberal. The formation of the supranational regulatory bodies was liberal. I'm talking about the UN, IMF, World Bank. How is it then, to take the Cuba crisis as an example, that the great nations came so close on several occasions to blowing us all up and even ending human history? How is it that after two great epic cataclysms in human history, the two world wars, we were so close to entering upon a third? Now, it may be argued that here at last we see the triumph of liberal principles in geopolitics. The world did not enter a third world war because we love peace. Are you quite sure, I ask? It is my opinion that the third global catastrophe was avoided not because of the prevailing level of peace, even though that did play its part, but because nuclear aggression was basically tantamount to acts of suicide. There was nothing to be gained by starting a nuclear war on that scale. And therefore, I think it was a principle of mutually assured destruction, not a love of peace, that prevented the nuclear war. Consider also that even after the Cold War ended, the spirit of peace lasted little more than a decade, maybe two. And even now, people are talking about the path of a Second World War because of Russian aggression in Ukraine and the clandestine operations in foreign countries. Obviously, the most famous being the death of Litvinenko in the UK. And all these would amount to acts of diplomatic aggression. Increasing intrusion of Russian military aircraft in foreign airspace without explanation. And by the way, I'm not even talking about China. We just seem to have the conditions of, no matter how much we love peace, something about how we do things and who we are just reverts to tension and conflict. Now, argument number 4, and this is the most controversial one, and I call it the end of liberal societies at home. The great triumphs of liberalism in the last century include the successes of civil rights movements, the growth of feminism and women's rights, and multiculturalism. Now, these are seemingly irreversible and prevailing. Surely we can look upon these as marks of progress. I fear for every one of them. I saw it in the Brexit campaign, where adherence to liberal principles was shown to be skin deep at home, where vast members of society paid lip service to liberalism, but deeply rooted were very illiberal sentiments, and as the campaign for Brexit grew, all the moral authority and common sense and anger of liberal society was not enough to change people's preferences. Once again, liberalism just didn't go far enough. Now consider the Black Lives Matter movement. All this expression of anger is just another one of liberal society's demonstrations of its strength in numbers. When there's an act of injustice, we rally around the victims and show them their support. But why it ultimately fails is because while we change the narrative, people will continue on face value to pay homage to these values. But when push really comes to shove, they would easily abandon it. I myself have seen through my own experiences, people at the top of really huge institutions do everything they can to sanction racism and to publicize the attitude of diversity and tolerance in their institutions. And yet, in very subtle ways, because they knew how the game was played, were the very perpetrators of racist judgment. And some employees suffered because of that. I.e., when it really mattered, they still had racist perceptions, no matter how much they went public and did this and had training of diversity for their staff and so on. And this brings me to multiculturalism. I don't know whether you've noticed, but multiculturalism seems to have done as much to prevent integration than to cause it. Look at the growing antagonism against the Muslim community. The rise of Islamic fundamentalism has put Islam on the spotlight, and this would naturally make its members vulnerable to negative public sentiment. What do vulnerable communities do at such a time? Well, the last thing they do is integrate because they feel threatened. They just don't feel safe to do so. Rather, Muslims have been emboldened to express their identity and confide in their doctrines. It is where they are safe. The same thing happens with minority cultures, the so-called black community and so on. There's been a natural emboldening of what I call, I think I'll just call blackness, since the murder of George Floyd. I dare say that it has a very antagonistic feeling against the majority cultures. And the prevailing sentiment that goes around is, you see, we have to look out for each other or we're not safe. It's really still us against them. In both cases, Islam or black minorities or whatever, we are moving further away from integration. It is done, I think, for perfectly good reasons, in my opinion, safety and identity. But it also serves as evidence for illiberal arguments. See, they're not really one of us. This regress can't be said to be down to one culture's fault or another. I don't think it's anyone's fault. But it's just further proof that after all the education, after all the enlightenment, liberal values aren't going deep enough. Furthermore, the liberal reaction to this regression has somehow found a way of defeating itself. With the best intentions, we liberals do what we can to make minority cultures feel empowered, especially when they're persecuted, right? Many minority communities feel supported by this, and it is good. But I've also found that others see this as a chance to advance very illiberal ethics in their own culture. I'm talking about things like FGM, female genital mutilation, arranged marriages, polygamy even. Hardly considered about 10 to 15 years ago in minority cultures in liberal multicultural societies. But now it is seen as an attempt to find who we are and go back to our roots. This is how we used to do things before these, white Western people came and gave us their rules. And the stigma against these, what I may call vices, is now taken to be an imposition of Western values and thus an attack on identity. Similar arguments are used to advance lots of other things. I've talked about arranged marriages, the subordination of women generally. Even though many women in minority cultures live in Western society and express their freedoms, fundamentally in their own communities, they're still not on par. There's still certain things they can't say or do, especially when it comes to religion. Now, religious codes are the hardest to break, so to speak. And this regards things like, sexual conduct, dress, interactions with mainstream society, and so on. I see this far more frequently now than I did 10 or 15 years ago. A Muslim girl, for example, is confused about how to be a Muslim, a woman, and a member of Western society. She believes in her freedoms, but if they go against her religious beliefs, she is accused of betraying her identity, which has sanctions, social sanctions. What is she to do? Same thing with black people. A friend of mine, I think it was the 2017 election, told his cousin that he had voted for the Tories, and his cousin gave him an absolute lambasting for doing this. He said, "How can you be black and vote for those people?" Now, my friend wasn't stupid. In fact, he was a very well-educated guy and he had his reasons. But he was basically told and shouted down by his own family, not using any rational argument of policies or whatever. It's just like, this is the identity. You're black, you can't vote Tory. It's as simple as that. Now consider the future. What the elections of Trump in 2016 and Brexit has shown me is that liberalism is the prevailing social narrative. It's what we all agree to. It is what fills the social space, the social talk. It's there in institutions, it's there in conversations, and so on. I fear that in reality, it is actually really supported by the minority. I see on the whole another retrogression of liberal social values over the next few decades, if not in law, in attitude. And this may include attitudes towards women's rights, minority rights, abortion, sexual liberties, homosexuality, nationalism. These are the main ones that we speak of. So the failure of liberal ideals to sustain themselves through recent history shows that it has more than just blind spots. And it has little to do with how right or wrong they are, and more to do with the human condition. I do not think that liberal values are weak. I actually think they are very strong, the strongest, particularly because they are universal. However, they are more like strong pillars built on shaky, sandy foundations of what I may just call the natural human condition. Humanity is not naturally liberal. And if you agree with people like Thomas Hobbes and Machiavelli, and I mean, they've all had different angles. However, it needs liberalism to correct its vices. And that's why we believe in them, but find it so hard to maintain them when the forces of identity and the corollary engines of identity persuasion and antagonism and hatred emerge from within us. So rather than being on this linear path of liberal progress, I think human history perhaps displays a perpetual cycle where liberalism and illiberalism are features of a wheel rather than a destination or even the path. One time one is on top and the other time the other. How can people think this way in the 21st century? We keep asking ourselves. Easily. The wheel is turning, and our turn may be coming to an end. Now look at the effects of, or should we say, the strength of liberal principles on the new coronavirus world. Strong pillars, yes, but the sands are shaking again. The wind is blowing stronger, and already the pillars are wobbling, and may soon, if we are unwise, see them topple all over again into unguarded, unrepentant hate. On the start of the lockdown about a year ago, the world was once again split down the natural fault lines of national boundaries. And nations, like before in the 20th century, turned inwards to themselves for safety and security. Global cooperation that had so often seen the world through the recent financial crisis, Russian aggression, Islamic terrorism, vanished as if it was all a dream. Every government was taken to be solely responsible for its infection rate, its death, its state, its health systems, the control of its borders, so on and so on. Cooperation over PPE was the first thing to go and was replaced by a narrative of blame. Now, this has been greatly intensified by the politicization of deaths and infections and the following comparison between countries and their health statistics. Once again, the world now sees itself through the lens of nationalism. The fear of the foreigner, seemingly justified by health, feeds into already existing and more vicious reasons for this fear. And once this fear takes root, I believe, as I believe it has, racism and xenophobia are never too far behind. Now, I can already see the race of the vaccine and its dissemination has already become political. It's less about health and more about national competition. Already nations are beginning to be blamed for not being fair in their distribution to other nations of their vaccines, prioritizing the health of their nations at the expense of others. There's even talk of trying to gain profits out of selling vaccinations and so on and so forth. It's become political. This will only serve to embed the world into illiberal sentiments. Political parties will move further to the right, towards illiberalism, should I say, as they reflect the views and sentiments of voters. And with it will come all the ugly, vicious parts of illiberal society that we think we had eradicated for good. Now, the response from the liberal community, which I accept to might be in the minority, will be typical. It will rightly adopt the moral high ground and use it to tell the rest of society what they should and shouldn't believe and how they should be fair. However, as the elections of Trump and Brexit have shown me, the silent majority will be defiant against this sermon, and they will be bold against it. Partly because of the message, perhaps the manner in which it is delivered, but illiberal sentiments will become bolder and more defiant against our message. So, see, already the sands are shifting, the winds of change are blowing harder, and the pillars, already wobbling, will soon start to topple. The question is whether a cycle of history can be stopped And what role we have to play in doing this? This will be the subject of the next address.